And without further ado, I don't know if I got through those fast enough. I don't think I did, but I just want to bring the aforementioned national treasure of the Nick Cage variety, Leah Carroll, to the stage. Leah writes about crime and social justice for Refinery 29. She's the author of Down City, a daughter story of love, memory, and murder. Please welcome Leah.
Hi guys, welcome. There's a lot of you. So thank you so much for coming. We have, I think, a really fascinating conversation whenever I'm writing down questions, and I've said this to the guys backstage, and I really want to know the answers. That's always a very good sign. So tonight we have with us Harold Schechter, and Harold Schechter is a professor emeritus at Queens College. He's the author of a series of historical true crime books, including the Edgar Award-nominated The Mad Sculptor. And he's the editor of the Library of America True Crime, an anthology. Harold, do you want to come out? And I forgot to mention, most importantly, we're going to be discussing Harold's book, Hell's Princess, which is the story of a female serial killer, which we don't get all the time, a historical female serial killer. We also have with us Cara Robertson, who is the author of The Trial of Lizzie Borden. It's amazing. It's getting amazing reviews from the New York Times, from NPR. It just came out last week. In her spare time, Cara she practices international humanitarian law, no big deal. And she actually began working on this project as part of her undergraduate thesis at Harvard. So it's been something that is many years in the making, and it's a fantastic book. And I think we're going to have a great conversation. And so, Cara, do you want to come out? Chairs are a little precarious. Hi. So I think that these books complement one another so much. And when I think about true crime, and I'm the author of a true crime memoir, and I write about contemporary true crime, and so I'm thinking about it most every day, I think that probably what is most fascinating to us is that a true crime story is always a story about something else, right? It's always a story about class. It's a story about race. It's a story about the things that make us essentially human. And one of the things that you both do in your books is you illustrate the ways in which these cases were very specific to their time and their place, and the ways in which the kind of legends surrounding them have evolved over time. And so I was wondering, Cara, can you tell us a little bit about what Lizzie Borden meant then and what she means now? And then Harold, I'd like to know, there's a lot in Cara's book and a lot in your book about kind of the issues that were swirling at the time. A big one for you was the issue of immigration, which everything that's old is new again, is still a, you know, this huge issue for us. But maybe Cara can begin talking a little bit about like the mythos of Lizzie Borden and what it meant then versus now.
Hello? Is it on? Okay. I had a dream about this, but you were all in your underwear, so I'm glad this is working and you're not. Lizzie Borden was someone who on the surface seemed to tick all the boxes of proper womanhood in her specific time and place. Her father was a rich man, so she had no need to work outside of the home. She was involved in culturally sanctioned activities, particularly at her church. She was the secretary-treasurer of her local Society of Christian Endeavor. She was someone who was a Sunday school teacher. And so the idea that someone like that would allegedly pick up a hatchet or an axe and murder her father and stepmother in cold blood seem to have implications beyond the actual crime. In other words, whether or not she actually did it, it seemed to pose a threat to the social order. The idea was that there were certain kinds of people who were criminals. There were criminal types, and those criminal types didn't look like native-born, upper-middle-class ladies like Lizzie Borden. So I think that that's what people were grappling with at the time. And there is a way in which, over time, the case got stripped of some of its specificity so that people could project onto it what they needed to project onto it, so that every generation essentially got its own Lizzie. And so I think that there's something about both the specificity of it, which was specifically threatening to the Gilded Age, and then there's something about the perceived universality of it, the idea that it's essentially a specifically unhappy family in one house, beset with festering tensions that explodes on one particular day. That is a story that can be rewritten over and over again.
And what do you think, Harold, what are the specifics of, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Belle, because her story isn't quite as well known as Lizzie's. And what are the specifics, the kind of, specifics as far as the political landscape and that kind of thing that played into her trial, that have evolved with time in the way that Lizzie Borden's story has?
Well, Hell's Princess is about a Norwegian immigrant named Belle Gunness, who came over here in 1883 and moved to Chicago and married a guy named Mads Sorensen, who, after he took out a fairly large insurance policy, met a sudden and mysterious death. And Belle ultimately used the money to purchase a farmhouse in the small Indiana town of LaPorte. And then she married another guy named Peter Gunness, who after also taking out a fairly large insurance policy, came to an even stranger sudden end. And then in 1905, about 3 years after Peter's death, Belle began placing matrimonial ads in Scandinavian language newspapers throughout the Midwest and luring lonely Norwegian bachelors to her farmhouse who would suddenly never appear again. Anyway, without going into all the details, turned out she was a serial murderer who was luring these guys to her farmhouse, instructing them first to bring all their life savings with them. And then she would, nobody knows for certain exactly how she dispatched them, but apparently while serving them a large, hearty Norwegian meal, which was one of the ways she managed to lure them with a promise of down-home cooking. These were very homesick Norwegians. She would then sneak up at night, deliver the coup de grace while they were asleep, and then take their bodies down to her cellar and butcher them like farm animals. One of the things I've written about many American serial killers. I mean, my area of specialization as a true crime writer is notorious, often long forgotten American serial killers and mass murderers of the past. And I've become very interested in the whole phenomenon of female serial murder, because until recently, the received wisdom was there was no such thing as female serial murders, which is not true at all. But there are very few female serial murderers who engage in the kind of butchery that Belle Gunness did. And that was something that attracted me to her story. But yeah, I mean, certainly people have spoken about her as a case of an immigrant pursuing the American dream. I mean, she was from Norway, not one of your shithole countries. But, she came here and pursued the American dream in her own pathological way. So anyway, that's the basic story about Belle.
And you touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that differentiates both Lizzie and Belle, and that I think has kind of kept us captivated by their stories over the years, and again, we're referring to Lizzie Borden's crime as her alleged crime, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but they challenged our notion of what a killer woman is, or a lady killer, in kind of the brutality of what they did and were accused of. And also I think that there was, in the coverage, which you go into, in the coverage of the trial, which you cover at length in your book, there was a lot of focus on Lizzie's looks. And there was a lot of focus in the opposite way on Belle's looks. They were kind of, these very completely different sort of looking women who had different stations in life. And, that's something that we still see today, right? So that's Jodi Arias, that's Casey Anthony, that's even the women who have come forward and accused Trump of sexual misconduct, and he's dismissed them by saying, like, have you seen that? That's still something we do to this day. Can you talk a little bit about, in your research, in going through these transcripts and these reports, what you saw about Lizzie as a woman, as a killer, and the perception of how that was talked about, things that you saw that run parallel to today's narratives?
Lizzie Borden's appearance was considered very important evidence, and it cut both ways. So that many saw in the unflappable, almost phlegmatic demeanor that she presented at the courthouse, a sort of, inborn dignity, exactly the kind of ladylike behavior and appearance that essentially, bespoke her innocence, that someone who looked like that and acted like that couldn't possibly be a killer, certainly not a killer in the manner that she was alleged to have killed her father and stepmother. Other people saw that she seemed to be too undemonstrative, that she seemed unconcerned, that she had this kind of coolness that seemed to suggest, a masculine sang-froid, the sort of character that would permit someone to commit the kinds of crimes that she was accused of committing. And so what I found interesting was one, the quantity of that discussion, that every single reporter talked about the way she looked, dressed, and acted in the courthouse. And secondly, the way in which it didn't seem as if that it was completely obvious which way the evidence fell. So that if they were predisposed to think that she was innocent, then they saw a confirmation in her behavior and her demeanor. And if they decided for reasons that had very little to do with her appearance that she was probably guilty. For example, the local Irish Catholic paper in Fall River had absolutely no sympathy for her and thought it was horrifying that it had taken so long to arrest her, and that if it had been, for example, the housemaid who had been arrested instead, who was also in the house at the time, that this would have happened very quickly and there would have been a Star Chamber proceeding and she would be swinging from the gallows.
Can I ask just one question? One fact that I learned was the maid's name. Can you just talk about? I just think this is so fascinating.
So the Bordens had a maid named Bridget Sullivan, who was an Irish immigrant, and they called her Maggie because Maggie was the name of their previous servant, and they just thought it was easier to call her Maggie.
Sorry to derail. I find that fascinating and very telling.
Yes. Yeah, I think that you see in the different views of those two women who were both in the house at the same time, that Lizzie Borden benefited from the ideas of essential goodness that seemed to come along with this kind of middle class femininity that she seemed to represent, and that someone like Liz, or the maid, Bridget Sullivan, would have been much easier to suspect because, after all, housemaids were known to have to use axes or hatchets to kill animals or cut wood. And so that wouldn't have been quite so hard to understand. I mean, fortunately for Bridget, she had an alibi, or the story might be quite different. One of Lizzie's lawyers, in fact, asked at the trial, you know, there are these two women in the house. In the natural course, who is the party to be suspected? You know, is it the stranger? He might as well have said, is it the, you know, immigrant housemaid, or is it the daughter who teaches in the Sunday school?
And conversely, Belle, you know, there are these descriptions of she's just this hulking, you know, Norwegian, sweaty mammoth of a woman, and which fed into a narrative.
Yeah. Well, Belle was not an attractive woman. She weighed about 300 pounds. Even in her more svelte days, she was no great beauty. I actually got into trouble. I've given up reading my Amazon reviews. You know, some of them are like, 1 star. The book came with a torn cover, whatever. But I got into trouble. I mean, some people were criticizing me because I, you know, was describing Belle as homely, you know, and felt that I was somehow being misogynist. Although I thought that I, you know, handled that particular aspect fairly delicately. You know, one of the things that was interesting to me, you know, it's a very different case from Lizzie Borden. I mean, the class issues are completely different. One of the things that's always interested me about the Lizzie Borden case is that in the 100-year span from Lizzie Borden till O.J. Simpson, you know, there were 3 very notorious double murder cases involving wealthy, prominent people. The Lizzie Borden case, then in the 1920s, something called the Hall Mills murder case, which was the most sensational case. It's largely been forgotten now, but it was the most sensational case of the 1920s, more so even than Leopold and Loeb or the Ruth Snyder, Judd Gray double indemnity case, and then the O.J. Simpson case. And in all of those cases, the defendants, even though I think clearly guilty, you know, were acquitted. And a lot, again, has to do with these class issues that you're talking about. The situation is very, very different in this small Indiana town with Belle. But what was interesting to me, culturally in a way, was how expectations of physical appearance have altered so much in the course of the century. You know, Belle had no trouble attracting husbands and potential husbands, even though, again, you know, physically, judged by our own contemporary standards, she was, you know, off-putting, scary, actually. So, yeah, I mean, but in terms of physical appearance, I mean, that was the main area that I was interested in.
And it was something that was remarked upon
Yes.
a lot in the coverage of the trial.
Yeah, yeah.
As almost sort of an indicator that clearly she's guilty.
That she was guilty.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And, you know, there are all these rumors about her sexual promiscuity that I think also had a good deal to do with, you know, her foreign origins. So, yeah.
And so you are a bona fide expert on true crime. You have clearly established yourself as an expert on true crime and, in fact, work as a lawyer. And in your book, you do bring up some parallels to documentaries like Making a Murderer and The Staircase. I wonder, but then when we were talking backstage about some of the film adaptations and stuff of Lizzie Borden's story, you said that when the hatchets come out, you have to close your eyes, which I thought was so fascinating. Can you guys talk a little bit about, you know, so we talk about how we're in this era of a true crime boom. What does that mean? And what does that mean? It struck me when you talked about the individuality of Lizzie Borden's story. And that's really something that I think your book does. It speaks to the specifics of this case. How do you feel about true crime, about the way that Lizzie Borden's story has come to become sort of a template for this thing that is now, there's a big giant festival about it, and Harold, if you can kind of give us your expert take on that as well. Cara, do you want to start?
Well, I've always thought of the Lizzie Borden story as, it's not the true crime story, because there are many before, but there's something foundational about it, and I think it's the way in which it is both a very specific window onto its time and place, because it was the O.J. Simpson trial of the day. There was the intense press coverage. It was a case that everyone seemed to follow day by day. That was the assumption. People were able to follow along with maps that were published in newspapers so that they could try to see if someone could have come in from the outside and how far was the distance between this point and that point. So there was a sense of the, as you say, of the great specificity of it. But there's a way in which it seems to be, it has a sort of universal mythic quality. I call it in the book a locked room mystery written by Sophocles. That there is a way in which the case sort of turns everyone into an amateur detective, and you want to solve it, and in the same way that you're gripped by these current true crime narratives that are very carefully designed, chapter by chapter, to reveal one twist after another. But then there seems psychologically something that transcends the time and place, and we want to know. How could someone do something like that? And what sort of a person could do something like that? And I think that being immersed in the Gilded Age gives one humility about making those assessments now. That those things are obviously very easy to see in retrospect, the way in which the biases or the preoccupations of an era come into play. But with that in mind, I think that we can see that in our own moment too. So that, just to take one example, the most recent adaptation of the Lizzie Borden story, the movie that came out last year, was very much a story about female rage, about a woman who was trapped in an intolerable situation, and her only way free of these rapacious men was to strike out with an axe. And I think there's nothing essentially true about that. It's just that that's what speaks to us, and it's not what spoke to people 50 years ago or 40 years ago.
That's interesting. So do you think that that notion of female rage, almost a reconsideration of Lizzie as a feminist icon, that's new?
Right. She was seen as a cautionary tale of what a misogynist writer might call a feminist. That came up in the 50s. That one examination of her story said, "Oh well, if there is such a thing as women's liberation, they're just following Lizzie out of the kitchen with the axe." And that, of course, seems absurd now. But that was what was the concern for them. And so I think that there are plenty of things in the story that you can make fit your own preoccupation.
So your question touches on a number of areas that are very interesting to me, and I've given a lot of thought to.
First of all, can we talk about how nobody should ever take out a life insurance policy ever? Is that a lesson you've come away with?
Yeah. So, years ago when Wikipedia first started up, I looked at their entry on true crime, and it said true crime began with a publication of In Cold Blood. by Truman Capote, which was actually off by about 300 years. Because true crime has always been a very, very popular genre. I mean, as soon as Gutenberg invented the printing press, they started turning out true crime books. And even before the invention of the printing press, true crime narratives were disseminated through oral murder ballads. And so people have always been fascinated by true crime. And again, one of the things that interests me, and this gathering is an example of it, is, what is it about true crime that is so fascinating and so absorbing, and that, attracts so much of our attention and interest? In America, the first printed works were true crime works. There were Puritan gallows sermons by people like Cotton Mather. Whenever a criminal was executed, he was expected to deliver some kind of edifying sermon on the gallows before they hanged him, and these were printed up and distributed. So there have always been true crime stories, and of course there have always been horrendous crimes. One of the things about Lizzie Borden that I think is important and fascinating, and that I've given a lot of thought to, although I haven't come up with any real answers, is why certain crimes enter into our cultural mythology, whereas other crimes that are equally as horrendous, if you do true crime research the way I do, I'm always reading old newspapers, you realize really on a daily basis there are hideous atrocities that are being committed all the time. And yet, this tiny infinitesimal handful, become, again, part of our, perennial cultural mythology. Something like Leopold and Loeb in the 1920s. Leopold and Loeb killed one child. I'm researching a book now set in 1927, which was 3 years after Leopold and Loeb, in which a guy blew up an entire public school in Michigan and killed 40 children. And yet nobody remembers the case or could name the person, except for me. So what exactly is it about those stories that makes them so gripping, that makes them so resonant? As you say, some of these stories are perpetually reinvented. I wrote a book years ago. My first true crime book was about a guy named Ed Gein, who was this Wisconsin necrophile and serial murderer whose story inspired Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs. And again, what was interesting to me is how that true crime was constantly being retold in ways that reflected the preoccupations and obsessions and anxieties of the era. But it's a mistake to think, it's interesting to me that we're living in this true crime boom. When I started writing, true crime was still a very, very disreputable genre. I think now it's achieved this respectability partly because of Serial and Jinx and so on and so forth.
But what makes those respectable?
What makes Lizzie what?
What makes those respectable? Like this kind of the idea of the prestige true crime documentary. Like, how come some of these stories are titillating and we shouldn't talk about them because it's actually in bad taste, and then some of them, like with Staircase and Making a Murder, are framed in a way that could possibly even be considered fairly irresponsible, but yet those become kind of tasteful fodder.
Well, they're all titillating. I believe, that it's a mistake for us not to acknowledge, some of the darker pleasures and gratifications we get from these stories. People rationalize why they read these kinds of works. I've had women, come up to me who've just gotten divorced and, say, I read about serial killers because I want to make sure I don't date one or something. But if you see something like the Casey Anthony case, which becomes this 24/7 obsession, largely, not exclusively, to a female audience, there's something going on there, about the way these stories allow us to safely indulge in socially unacceptable fantasies. And I think that that's actually a very, very useful and important function of them. And I don't think, it makes sense, to try to rationalize that away. So.
And Cara, would you say that was, that was the case in Lizzie's trial? That it gave us an opportunity to talk about those things?
Yes, there was always a rush every day to get tickets. In fact, there was such a crowd assembled outside the courthouse that special officers had to be designated to guard the doors, and they even set up a new fence and gate, so that there was the sense that this was much like the World's Fair in Chicago that had just recently opened. This was an important cultural event that people had to go to, and there was something particularly attractive to the women, that there was that all of the journalists noticed, and these were mostly male journalists, noticed that the audience was mostly female, and they in fact constituted a sort of second jury, one that was a lot less sympathetic. And in going to see if they could find the monster, beneath the unremarkable woman on trial for the crimes, they became, in the eyes of the journalists, monstrous themselves. One of the things that also struck me was one of the journalists noticed that when particularly gruesome testimony was put forward by the medical experts who were called by the prosecution, that Lizzie Borden often hid her face under her fan, and that was, what you would expect, both because it was horrible. I had the same temptation a few times, and also because, insofar as she's performing her kind of femininity, that was important to be horrified and shocked. But the journalist also noticed that when the same kind of testimony was explored by her own team, when they succeeded, for example, in cross-examining these witnesses and punching holes in the case against her, that she looked on with rapt attention. And he observed this, but he stepped back from the implications of it, and simply said, well, that's to be expected. Women are like that. So there was a sense even then, although we think of it as a recent phenomenon, that there was something in these brutal events that particularly attracted women.
I've never written or researched a case of a sensational, horrific murder in which most of the attendees of the trial weren't women, and journalists are always commenting on that. But in terms of the kind of interest that these horrific crimes generate, the Sunday after investigators dug up the dismembered remains of a dozen bodies in Belle's backyard, 16,000 people showed up at her farm. They were running special trains from Chicago. There were people literally, they set up lemonade stands, and there were people selling ice cream. There were people selling postcards often of the dismembered remains. You can buy them on eBay. They made a makeshift morgue out of one of the outbuildings on the farm. And there are photographs, again, you can see these online, of people, men, women, children, lined up so they could go. It looks like, they're waiting to go to Pirates of the Caribbean or something. It doesn't, they're lined up so they could go through and see, the reeking, dismembered remains of these bodies. So the sites of notorious crimes have always attracted hordes of morbid curiosity seekers. And, they would always want to come away with some kind of souvenir. There have been some places where horrible murders have taken place that the tourists have completely disassembled, the entire house. You know, nowadays, of course, you know, the police will cordon this stuff off, but in the old days they didn't. Anyway. So.
No, it's fascinating, and this is a story. Lizzie Borden's story is something that, as we touched on, you've been preoccupied with since at least 1990, since at least your time as an undergrad. Do you feel like you came away all these years later? Do you think about the case differently?
It's an interesting question to me, and something I went back and forth with my editor. I sort of am in the same place. You know, it's really difficult to imagine how anyone else could have done it. Although there are reasons that I discuss at length in the book why one might have a reasonable doubt. I think, you know, less than a reasonable doubt. There's this unreasonable certainty that a woman like that couldn't have done such a thing at the time. And so since, you know, obviously I write from a different time and place, I don't have that. So to me, it seems as if it's hard to imagine that anyone else could have done it. But at the same time, it's very difficult to imagine that someone could have committed both crimes and removed all traces of blood within an hour and a half. So I left it open in the book, you know, spoiler alert, and I'm comfortable with the idea that we'll just never know.
And I want to say that a good reason to buy both of these books is that even though these are both historical crimes that have been talked about for many, many years, they both have mysteries at their heart that remain intact in the book and in the books, and I think are really fascinating. So you should all buy the books. I think we can probably open it up for questions and answers.
For questions, we have a mic set up in the middle, so if you guys could just come and line up with the microphone, that would be wonderful.
Yay. You're all going to want to ask a question in like 5 minutes.
Harold, tell me about the way in which women like to use poison and watch their victims die.
Well, thank you, Catherine. No, I mean, again, I got very interested years ago in the question of female serial murder, because for a long time the received wisdom was that there was no such thing, up until Aileen Wuornos. Supposedly she was the first female serial killer. But, you know, there have been hundreds of women who have killed sequentially many victims. Anyway, I wrote a book about a woman named Jane Toppin, who was a nurse at the turn of the 20th century, who ultimately confessed to having murdered 31 people. And she was actually listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for a long time as America's most prolific serial murderer before John Wayne Gacy. Anyway, in researching the book, what I came to believe is that there are many, many female serial killers, but they commit their crimes in different ways from male serial murderers. You know, Camille Paglia, the culture critic, says there is no female Jack the Ripper, which is true. But that doesn't mean there are no female serial murderers. It just means that there are no female killers who commit the kind of sexual mutilation murder that Jack the Ripper does. That seems to be a very specifically male form of serial murder. You know, very phallic, penetrative, and aggressive, and, you know, preying on anonymous victims and so on and so forth. What used to be called lust murder. Women serial killers are no less sadistic, but they tend to commit their crimes with poison. They're really two different gender manifestations of the same phenomenon. You know, Jane Toppin was a psychopathic sex killer. She confessed that when she would murder her victims, and, you know, when they were in their death throes, she would get into bed with them and embrace them and experience what she called voluptuous delight. she would have an orgasm. So the difference between male and female serial killers is male serial murder, again, looking at the Jack the Ripper model, very indiscriminate. You know, these guys will troll for victims or go to a bar and pick somebody up, and, you know, very phallic, penetrative. Women tend to need to have an emotional relationship with the people they kill. They will kill their spouses, they will kill their children, they will kill their siblings. They seem to need to have a certain kind of intimacy before they will murder them, but their crimes are no less sadistic than that of people like Jack the Ripper. In fact, what I came to believe is that somebody like Jane Toppin was actually a far more vicious serial murderer than Jack the Ripper was, because Jack the Ripper's atrocities were all committed post-mortem. He would slit the throats of his victims and then mutilate their corpses, whereas Jane Toppin took this incredible sadistic delight in prolonging the suffering of her victims. She would administer these poisons, make them horribly sick for a few days, then she might cut back on the dosage, you know, bring them back to health, and then finally deliver this fatal dosage. But they were subjected to far worse suffering than Jack the Ripper's victims. So, and there have been many, many female serial poisoners. Back in the late 19th century, there was a whole string of them. They were called American Borgias.
What was that word?
American Borgias. They were compared to Lucretia Borgia, although apparently Lucretia Borgia didn't really poison that many people. She's got a bad historical rap.
Cara, I understand that in the course of your research, you uncovered some letters written by Lizzie that had not been discovered before. So because this is probably the most researched murder mystery of all time, I wonder, how did you happen to find them?
Well, you need to keep in mind the town in which the murders took place. It was a prosperous mill town called Fall River, Massachusetts, which at the time was more cosmopolitan than that sounds. It had regular ferry service to both Boston and New York. And there were these founding mill families from which Lizzie Borden was descended. And so there are these Yankee families that kept everything and mostly put it in the attic. And they needed desperately a kind of Marie Kondoizing of their stuff. And so things have come into the Historical Society just even in the past 10 or 15 years. And they are letters, for example, that Lizzie Borden wrote from jail. And so that they can, I felt confident that they actually were reliable, that one wouldn't have the danger of overreading them. The problem with the other letters from Lizzie Borden is they tended to be, one or two after the trial, and it's, at that point she's notorious, and so it's very easy to just make a lot out of what might actually not be there. So I hold out hope that there still may be more, in a summer home somewhere that's still, owned by a cranky Yankee.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Unfairly, I don't know the facts in the book, but is there such a theory, a justifiable murder, and that's why a jury that assumes she killed the parents couldn't convict because they thought that what she did was justifiable?
I'm just going to repeat that really quickly. So asking, is there a theory that what she did was justifiable in some ways because of, could it be justifiable?
Right. It's an interesting question because I think that's what we look for now. We think, we look at the same story and there has to be some dark secret in that family. There has to be, this must be a case of incest. or something. The Lizzie movie, as I said, postulates that Lizzie was epileptic, that she was in love with the housekeeper, and that she was in danger of being put into an asylum. And there's no evidence for any of these theories, particularly. What struck me about doing the research is that I think there was very little exploration of the idea that there might be some good reason for it, and that there seemed to be, the obvious reason was not dissimilar to one that we've just been talking about, was there's a money motive. And the order of the deaths is significant for that the stepmother was killed about an hour and a half before her husband, Mr. Borden, and that meant that Lizzie Borden and her sister inherited the entire Borden estate as opposed to having to share a third. And there had been some talk before the murders that Mr. Borden might be making a will, and some speculation that it might be a will that the daughters might not like as much. But that significantly is something that really the prosecution can't bring itself to discuss. That the idea that a daughter, in particular, but a woman like Lizzie Borden, would kill her father over money was too horrible. So they looked for, essentially the 19th century version of the kind of psychiatric explanation we might have now, the magic thing that turns Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde, so that to explain how somebody who seems so unremarkable could do something so horrible. So a long way to answer your question is I think that the jury really just said that a woman like her couldn't have done it, not whether she actually did it or not. That there was no exploration of anything else.
Can I have a follow-up question to that, which is that these themes. We see this, there's woman Alice Boland who's written this really amazing book called Dead Girls, and she has a chapter in it called The Husband Did It. And it's about watching Dateline, which is essentially, every episode of Dateline is an exercise in getting through 60 minutes until the husband is just revealed to have done it. When we talk about things like money as a motive, but people are so incredulous of that when looking at a person like Lizzie Borden, why do you guys think that the human mind wants to make these leaps and bounds as opposed to just saying, oh, it probably was money? This is there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious if in both of your research you came up with any kind of thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, the question is why couldn't it have just been money?
Why do we want to say it had to be, she had to have snapped, something had to have happened, it had to be this, when the motive seems fairly logically, it could have been money, but yet people want to spend 100 years deciding that it was something else.
Well, in the case of Belle Gunness, after killing two husbands, she already had a fair amount of money. And, again, there are other ways. She had actually a very prosperous, thriving farm in this small town. So there's a wonderful book, by the way, that I recommend, very pioneering book on the subject called Women Who Kill by Ann Jones, that I highly recommend to anybody who is interested in the subject. But Ann Jones calls Belle Gunness Bluebeard with a profit motive. So, the mercenary aspect of it was certainly a feature of the crimes. But again, it doesn't account for why she was killing and chopping up lonely Norwegian bachelors and burying them in her hog lot, right? There was something else going on there. So.
In the case of Lizzie Borden, a money motive is male. So it's quite simple. It's not just that. So that the combination of the idea that it might be something that mercenary would definitely signal an outside male perpetrator. That it had to be. And every suspicious immigrant in town was rounded up essentially examine whether he could have done it. And that the lack of a comprehensible motive was something that really weighed heavily in the defense favor, because there wasn't anything that would seem to justify it.
Hi. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So you talked a little bit about our fascination with true crime. And my question is, are we really experiencing a surge in interest in true crime, or have we actually historically, over the course of time, been just as interested? And if we are experiencing a surge in interest, or a resurgence, a resurging in interest, are there some cultural factors that might influence, the public's interest in true crime?
Well, I mean, I think that there has always been a lot of interest in true crime. I mean, one of the things that differentiates the current moment is it's achieved, again, a kind of cultural respectability that it never had in the past. I mean, even, when Capote's In Cold Blood came out, he was very upset because it wasn't even nominated for a National Book Award. In Cold Blood is a great masterpiece of 20th century American literature, but because it was true crime, even though it did get a lot of publicity, it was still looked at a little askance. When I first started writing true crime, which is going back to like 1980, well, late 1980s, the line in American publishing was that readers weren't interested in reading about old crimes. I couldn't get my first book published in hardcover, because back then true crime was just like a paperback, genre. So I think, again, the thing that distinguishes the current cultural moment is this new respectability that true crime has achieved. Exactly what is responsible for that, I am not entirely certain. So yeah, I mean, that's my take.
I have a thought on this. So in my book, I actually explore my own mother's murder, but I was always really fascinated by true crime growing up, and I think in part I was fascinated by it because I was, my mother was a sex worker and a drug addict, and so I was never allowed to say that she had been murdered because only bad people got murdered. And I think that for women, you touched on this a little bit, and it's not necessarily about, we can kind of, there are people out there who say like, well, I want to find out what a murderer looks like so that I never wind up being murdered, but the fact remains that most women are more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner than anybody else in their life. So as a woman, crime is something that is very real and concrete in our lives every day. And I think that, you talk about, I remember as a kid, the Ann Rule paperbacks in the supermarket, and it was this very ghettoized, it was a woman's thing. And even kind of when the Investigation Discovery and all these shows came up, they were so popular because they were able to advertise to women, which is an incredibly lucrative group. And I think that we're seeing, I think that if there's any kind of change in the way it's being covered, and you're the expert clearly, but I think we're seeing women's voices in a way, and you touched on this when you discussed how all of a sudden we want to talk about Lizzie Borden as a case of female rage. I think that we're seeing women's voices and women's fears maybe legitimized in a way that we didn't maybe say 20 years ago, when it was something that was just sort of, it was considered schlocky. That's my theory anyway.
And the technology too.
Yes.
So that it it doesn't have to just be the Lifetime Network for women doing the Woman in Jeopardy movie of the week inspired by actual events. That there are hundreds of channels, and then podcasting obviously has opened up new opportunities to discuss the subject.
So I think this is our last question, and then we have beer, which is great because it's 1,000,000 degrees in here. Is that right? I think that's right, yes.
I have a question specifically about Belle Gunness. One of the aspects of her story that fascinates me the most is that Some people think that she died when her farmhouse burned down. Some people think she just moved on and continued a new life somewhere else.
This is one of the unsolved mysteries.
So
Yes.
I want to know, and we'll never know, but I want to know what you think.
Well, my book is subtitled "The Mystery of Belle Gunness," and you know. So, for those of you who don't know, the way Belle's crimes were discovered was that her house burned down, and searchers discovered in the cellar the body of a woman clutching the bodies of 3 children. They were all incinerated, and you know the immediate belief was that the house had caught fire, and Belle had gathered up her children and tried to save them, and they'd all died, and so on and so forth. The one feature that was unusual was that the body of the woman was missing its head. Anyway, very shortly thereafter, they discovered the dismembered remains of all of her victims in her, you know, private death garden, as the tabloids called it back then. So it became and remains an enduring mystery of the case. There were some people who believed very, very strongly that the body was not Belle's, that she had lured another woman to the farm and killed her and beheaded her and set this whole thing up, and that she escaped. Other people believed, you know, that it was Belle, and somehow her skull was incinerated. Anyway, in researching the book, I felt I was going to be able to solve the mystery, but I didn't. You know, even into the 1930s, there were people. There was a woman in Los Angeles named Esther Carlson in the 1930s who poisoned a few people, and people were sure it was Belle Gunness. She died before she could be brought to trial. She died of tuberculosis, but they brought people from LaPorte who had known Belle very well to view her corpse, and they positively identified her as Belle Gunness. However, there has been a Norwegian researcher who has a very interesting lecture on the subject on YouTube, who has researched the background of Esther Carlson and come to the conclusion that she was not Belle Gunness. I actually, about 6 months ago, got an email from a Los Angeles police detective who specializes in arson murders, who, based on the material in my book, did a very, very detailed kind of profile and came to the conclusion that the body wasn't Belle's, that she had escaped. Again, there were other people.
Is Belle Gunness in the audience tonight? Is that what you're saying? Is she in the audience tonight? Is she here?
Yeah, I
Belle?
think she'd be a little old, but hopefully not. So nobody knows. Again, it's still an unresolved issue.
Do you have an opinion, or do you prefer to leave it to mystery?
You know, yeah. I always tell people that there are 3 things I dislike in narrative: subtlety, complexity, and ambiguity. And I hated to end my book on an ambiguous note. Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth. I really do. I mean, there are times I feel, you know, that she died, and other times again, this email I got from this LA detective was very, very persuasive. You know, one of the questions was the torso of the woman I can't remember, it weighed like 95 pounds, you know, whereas Belle weighed 300. You know, and the question was, could a fire of that intensity have reduced her body? You know, during the trial, her handyman was ultimately tried for setting the fire. You know, and they had people bringing in roast beefs, you know, and overcooking them, you know, to see how much, you know, mass a piece of meat would lose. But this detective, you know, was fairly certain that, you know, that the body couldn't have been Belle. So anyway, the answer is I don't have a firm opinion.
Okay, everyone, a big, huge round of applause for Leah and Cara and Harold. They will be signing books, and you can line up for that, but also there is free beer brought to you by our friends at Trogs. And again, if you want to come and hang out with us for the rest of the fest, it's www.deathbecomesus.com. And I just want to say my nickname in college was the Butcher of Men. So that's so crazy. The mystery's solved. I'm right here. Thank you, everyone.